Okay, right, so if I want to do any kind of animation on this text, then I'm going to have to specify using this animate drop down what it is I want to actually change about this. Now remember that any animation you do is only ever a change in properties over time. Okay, so that's the first thing here. So I want to change a property over time. I need to decide which one do I want to change. I'm going to pick something really simple here. I'm going to change the position. I'm going to give myself a little bit more space here so you can see it all. Now what you'll find when you're working on text animators is that you actually need quite a lot of layer to look at, because there's so many drop down things in here that you're toggling between that a lot of the time I find myself with the composition window kind of squashed up here, but I can see enough, you know, I can see my line of text. I might need to pull it down a bit for this one, but that should do me. Okay, so I've just do that again. I went up to animate. Now the text properties at the top there is where you go to animate the text initially. So animate, and I go to position. As soon as I've done that, you'll see that all the anchor points pop up, so I know where it's going to move relative to. Now what I have here is I have an animator, I have what's called a selector, and down at the bottom I have the property that's being changed within this animator. So the first thing I need to do is I need to say, okay, well, when I select certain portions of this text, I want them to animate up to a certain height. So first thing I need to do is set that height. So I go to my Y position property and I'll push it up here. Now first thing you'll notice, everything moves. The entire line moves. This is only one half of the animation effect. The first thing to do is to set the property at the value that you want it to animate to. The next thing I want to do is I want to select which text is going to be moved to that new value and when. That's where the range selector comes in. The range selector is one of three types of selectors. It's the first one that you kind of learn because it's the simplest one. So we'll start with the range selector here. Now the range selector selects a range, as you might imagine, and the range is which area within this line of text is going to be affected to take this new value. At the moment, by default, the range covers the entire text. Now if you look closely, you'll see that there's a line there and there's a little arrow pointing inwards at that end, and there's another one at this end. These are the extremities of my range. Okay. If I want to, I can go in here in the composition view, hover over that arrow. You'll see again a little range selector icon pop up next to my arrow tool. That indicates that I can push that range in there. You should start to kind of see how this thing works now. Basically everything within range is selected to go to the new value. Everything outside of range is left untouched. Okay, so that's how range selectors work in their most simple sense. Now if I open up the range selector properties here, you'll see that there's a few parameters that I can change. I've got my start, my end, my offset. These are the simple ones before we go into the more advanced stuff. So my start is set to 19%. I actually just did that. So if I click that and hit that to 25, it will go 1/4 of the way in the line of text, and now my range is going from 22% to 65%. So this is the range and this is what's selected. The end just pulls in the end of the range there. Now the offset is where you can also start to animate this by moving the entire range either left or right. Okay, so you can kind of start to see now where this is going. So it's all about adjusting the properties of the range to make this animation happen. Now what you'll notice is at no point have I keyframed the position property, and this is what we're going to stick to while we learn this. Now you can adjust the position property, but it's much more valuable to you at this point to get working on the range selectors and leave the position as is. This is actually quite common. Most of the time you won't actually touch the position. You'll just change it once and then you'll kind of get to work on the selectors. Okay, so that's the start, end and offset. If I toggle open the advanced, I get more properties. Now they're quite simple. There's a lot of stuff here, I'll admit, but they're all fairly easy to kind of get your head around. Now the first one is just asking me whether or not I want to be basing all of this start, end and offset information on percentages, which it currently is, or on the index. Now the index is just which character I'm on. So if you think about the index as being any character and space as we go from left to right. So this is index 0, index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on. So if you want it to be exact to the character, then set that to index. If you want it to be just a percentage of the width of the text, then leave it at percentage. It's based on characters, so when I move this range selector, each character drops down or remains up. If I change that to characters excluding spaces, then it won't take the spaces into account. It will just go from character to character. Words, it will only go word by word. You'll see text up, text won't move for me, but anyway, text down. Okay, and you can change from words then to lines, and that will basically just start moving the line up and down. Now this will come into its own when you've got multiple lines of text. At the moment I'm just going to leave it at characters because that's where you get the most kind of fluid and dynamic kind of movement as you move across. Now the next one is the amount, and the amount again can be keyframed to counter the change that you've made. So you can have it set to go to this height, but you can also use the amount property to say, okay, well, don't always go to the full change, only go to half the change or a quarter of the change. So that's just the amount of difference between the original state and the state that you've specified down here. Okay, so that's another way that you can change the actual height that this goes to. Now the next one is really important, and this is the shape. Now the shape is set to square. Now you can kind of see what square relates to here. Within the range and outside of the range, when it gets to the edge of the range, it just goes straight up, across, straight down, pretty much. I mean, you have to accept that this is on its way down at the moment. It's not kind of going at an angle, it just hasn't come down yet. So this is square. If you set it to a triangle, you get a triangle shape. If you set it to round, you get a round shape. And similar to the round shape, when you set it to smooth, you get a round shape, but one that gradually kind of eases into that shape and then eases back out of it. So if you want it to look like it's kind of, as the range moves across, that it's kind of easing it up into the air, then you'll use something like a smooth shape. Now, it gets slightly trickier to kind of get your head around when you go from these simple shapes to what's called ramping. Now, ramping uses the range in a different way to the ones that we've been looking at. What we've been looking at is everything inside changes, everything outside doesn't change. Now, when you set the shape to ramp up, what it actually does is it uses the range to set a ramp. Okay, so everything within the range is now going from the old original value to the new value and then leaving it there. Okay, so you can see very clearly what the ramp means in a visible sense here. So if I change the offset, it has the effect of moving everything up and then moving everything down. So it gives a nice effect of things kind of floating up into the air, things falling back down to earth. So ramp up literally ramps up to the new value and leaves it there. Ramp down does the opposite. Okay, so you're either working within a shape where everything inside the shape changes and everything outside doesn't, or you're ramping to a value or ramping down from a value, and that value, as always, is set once here in the position. Now, just to go back to the smooth shape, the smooth shape gives you some easing functions here, so you can change the smoothness that it eases when it gets to the height and the easing as it goes into that shape in the first place. That is basically it. apart from the last one here, which is the mode. This is kind of tricky. What the mode does is, first of all, it will be set to add by default. If you set that to subtract, then it will do the opposite. Okay, now the mode really only comes into its own, or not only when it comes into its own, but it can do some very complex things when you're working with multiple range selectors. So you're not limited to just one range selector. You can have as many as you want. They can intersect with each other, they can work together, they can do a number of different things, but the mode is where they'll intersect. That's where you change how they intersect. Now we'll come back to that when we look at a different type of a range selector in the next class. But just at the moment you can just look at it as either subtract or add, and that will invert if you set it to subtract, and when it's set to add it will work in a more predictable kind of a way. Now that is the range selector. Now all of these can be named as usual, so it could be rise up to new height, if you want to call it something like that, and then the range selector might be humpback shape or something like that. And you can have as many animators and you can have as many range selectors as you need. Okay, so that is text animators and range selectors.